part of the economy that I'm criticizing. It's not only outside of history that we are all about. I think it's quite obvious to point out that money is minted and was always fabricated by kings and princes and leaders and governments and banks. So unless we are bartering, it's very difficult to escape that reality. But the extent to which we want to compromise our principles and take money, which might be dirty, and all money is dirty, might differ according to our values. The other little image that I wanted to start with is something that a few people of my generation in IETM may have heard. A fellow called Neil Wallace, who used to be very active in IETM, who said once, IETM is a network of professionals in the performing arts sector, and we are either resource givers, like a festival director who can give permission, or resource seekers. Now that was a few years ago, and I think the situation has changed to a great deal. For one, the sources of funding that we can approach now have changed a lot in this region, in the mainland region. Cultural institutes used to be the place where we all went, whether we were European or non-European, for funding. That has significantly changed over the years. The cultural institutes have formed clusters and groups and an association called UNIC, which you probably know, which goes to the same sources of funding that we, the independent sector, goes to. It's kind of a shock. We're competing for funds. Foundations, which have been a traditional source of funding for all of us, wherever we live, have started to also go to some other foundations that we would go to raise money. So the foundations we are going to are also competing with the independent sector. Foundations have also become actors. They become initiators. They become festival creators. They become performance and co-production commissioners. So I think that the whole situation is much more fluid, and probably it will become much more fluid. And that gives me a good segue to introduce the panel, because people on here are also not one thing or the other. They have been, some of them, artists or architects. They have worked for organizations which have sought resources, and they have been working for organizations which give resources. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Rana, who knows no introduction, of course, who is now in a position of managing clusters and clusters of projects, re-granting, but also, as we know, as one of the founders of Atijahad and a commissioner for Damascus and other projects which commission. You've been in both hats. You've worn at least both hats. Jesper, you have been working for a festival, Santos na Cidade, a very emblematic festival in Lisbon. So you were looking for resources, now you're giving them. And you've been living in at least 4 countries and active in festival countries. Stephen, you have been theater playwright, festival director, the commission, leaflet committee, and now you're in the British Council looking after money and partnerships. Pascal Brunet, I know that you started life as an architect, student at least. Had gone through many different changes in your life, including being very involved in the Mediterranean, setting up networks and so on, and for the last 10 years, perhaps, then working as the director of an interface between European sources of funding on many different levels, not only cultural and not only in Europe, giving that information and helping people access those funds. Amar, you are amongst us the theoretician, the policy analyst, person who's working for the Algerian Development Bank, African Development Bank. Oh, okay. And so we were going to start with you because we hope that you will give us a more theoretical background. Thank you.
شكرا. سأتكلم باللغة العربية. يعني سأقوم ب PowerPoint.
I'll be using a very short PowerPoint presentation.
سأتكلم عن تجربتي في
I'll be speaking about my experience not in the African Development Bank, but as a person who's lived in different countries and a person who has dealt with different donor institutions.
سألتنا
Mary asked us to work on this title or question, and since the question is quite complicated and needs many hours to answer, I decided to use a caricature, but not in the artistic meaning, but in the literature meaning, so that I facilitate my own work and the way I want to lay down my ideas. When there is an artist who asks for a donation or for a grant from a state, whether from the public or the private sector, if it's of course an authoritarian state, then his or her art will be constrained and his work should be to glorify the regime. An example about that is Algeria. But if there is an artist who lives also under an authoritarian system but asks for international funding, so I think it's something impossible. And here I can give you also the example of Algeria. It's not authorized for the foreign entities to fund the artists who are resident in our country. Now, what about an artist who lives in a democratic context or country and asks for public funding? Here, I think that there will be some kind of artistic freedom. Now, if we have an artist also in a democratic context asking for private funding, so from a private entity, then we will have an art-oriented market. And now, if we have an artist living under a democratic system that has a strong economy and asks for a grant or a donation on the international level, so here the result is the same. He or she doesn't need the funding from the international arena because the country, his country or his state is taking care of that. And my last example, and this is where I'll be focusing, if there is an artist living in a democratic context but where the economy is weak and asks for international funding, then his art
حسب الإيديولوجيا
will
أو
be
حسب
ideologically oriented
استراتيجيات
or will be based on the
يعني الجهة
strategies
المانحة
of
الأجنبية.
the donating
وسأركز على
entity.
هذا المثال
So I'll
لأنني
be focusing
كما
on this example
أعيش في
because, as I said,
وأسافر
I'm
كثيرا
living
في
in the
المنطقة
Ivory Coast and Cote
في البنين
d'Ivoire,
على سبيل
and
المثال.
I travel to
البنين دولة
Benin, for example. That is a state,
دولة ديمقراطية
a democratic
والفنان
state,
فيها
and there,
يعني بما أن الاقتصاد ضعيف
since the
والتمويل
economy is weak
الجهات الوطنية ضعيف
and also the funding from the national entities is weak,
يتوجهون كثيرا
so most of the artists
للجهات الداعمة
go towards the foreign or international funding.
وهنا أعطيكم مثال.
Let me give you here an example
عن يعني لوحة فنية
about
أو عرض فني قام
an
به
artwork that was done
فنان من البنين.
by an artist
يعني
from
طلب
Benin.
من أشخاص من
He
البنين أن
asked
ينبطحوا
some people from Benin to
داخل المركز الفرنسي
lie down inside the French cultural
أن يدوسوا على
center
ظهورهم.
so that people can walk on their backs.
وكما ترون معظم
as you see,
من يذهب إلى المركز الفرنسي
most of those who go to the cultural center in
يعني
Cotonou
فرنسيين
are
وأوروبيين.
French, are
ويمكنهم
Europeans,
كذلك إن أرادوا
and if they want,
أن يعني يأخذوا أبنائهم
they can also take their children with them
لكي تكون لهم أول خطوات
so they can take their first steps
دعس
on
الإفريقي.
the backs of the Africans.
يعني هنا نرى أطفال يتدربون كيف
So we see how children are trained to step on the backs of
يعني
the
محادثة مع
Africans.
الفنان.
And I was able to
وقال
speak
لي
to
أنها
the
يعني
artist.
performance. وقلت
He
له
told me this is a
أنا
performance.
أتحداك إن كنت
So
إن كان بإمكانك أن
I
تضع
said to him, I
5
challenge
أوروبيين
you
مكان
to
هؤلاء
put
البنين.
5 Europeans in the
ولم
place
يستطع
of those
طبعاً.
people from Benin.
وأعطيته
And
سنة
of course he wasn't
ولم يستطع.
able to do this. I gave him
So,
1 year to do it and he was not able to do it.
ما أردت أن أبين به أنه
So this is
في ظل
what
ديمقراطية
I wanted
الفنان
to
الذي
show you,
يحتاج
to explain
إلى
that when we have democracy, when an artist needs international funding, this means that his or her art will be oriented the way the donating entity wants it, and here the donating entity is the French cultural center in Cotonou. So the question is, can we stop the international funding? Of course not. If there is an entity that has good intentions in supporting the artists and the democratic contexts that have a weak economy, then they need only to show their positive intention, their good intention, and put transparent criteria for this end, criteria that are based on competition, so that artists or citizens can have an idea about the intentions of this donor. In my conclusion, I would like to say that in the best case scenario, artists need a democratic context with a strong economy to be able to have their artistic freedom of expression without any constraints or problems. Because for me, the artist who accepts grants from foreign entities, from international funding, then they will not, or who will not respect the criteria, then it's like he got his money from an authoritarian regime that is telling him how to do his job. And I think that within both these trends, meaning when we have the authoritarian regime or the other, then if the artist doesn't want to receive this funding, we need to call this as being a resistance. And when they live under a democratic context, but they don't have national funding, so if they refuse such funding, like what we saw in Benin, then this is called dignity, or karama in Arabic. Thank you very much.
How long have we got to discuss this? Like 6 hours? I think that we could either just forget the rest of the discussion and talk about that artwork for the rest of the evening, or we could just talk about your presentation and deconstruct it. So I think there would be a lot of interesting discussions just around it. Wow, and we've got the last session, and we're supposed to be quick. Oh dear, well, there's lots of discussions in the bar at night. I made me control myself from reacting to that. I don't know, but I will.
You asked for that.
Provocative, yes. Take notes. The questions that you have later, okay, or the comments. They're never questions. They're only comments. So, I'd like to follow that by another provocative person. Who has written an article for the Flemish, what was used to be called the Flemish Theatre Institute's magazine, Quran. And he very kindly, a long time ago, he very kindly worked on a Google translation to put it into English. But I would really like IETM and the Student or whatever the BCI is now called, to be able to publish that article because it's extremely good. Jasper, what do you think about the role of institutions, public institutions, funding in foreign countries?
Great to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. And should I speak up? Okay. Well, yes, that article, it was just an easy kind of answer in a very busy period. When the question came, like, what how are we going to coordinate this session? I said, well, something was said about that a long time ago. But I think some of the ideas, maybe because of the urgency of our times, have become a little bit stronger and radical in that sense, and on my point of view. But a lot of the ideas are still the same. And maybe the one thing that one would start with in the context of what was said in this, what was sort of thrown as an initial phrase in this session is that there is inevitably always a power relationship. There's always an agenda on the part of funders, and if we're talking about funders, the whole discussion about art in conflict, somebody else earlier expressed that we're not very, how to say it, happy with the term art in conflict. I think it's very hard to find a place in the world that's not in conflict if you would, according to me, find the correct definition of what conflict is. So I think the correct definition is maybe that there is a context whereby there is a certain comfort and good conditions to create art, and then there's a gradient towards contexts where the conditions to create art are not there. From an institutional point of view, from a sort of money infrastructure point of view, in certain cases from a quite direct influence from local government point of view. And so where a number of international institutions with an agenda, always with an agenda, which for a large part can often subscribe as people in this room with to a certain level, very often quite common ideas about where we should go to. But which are also problematic very often because there is an imposition which is quite strong. So within that context, I think these kind of organizations always have an agenda, and we always have to mediate that agenda there's always a power relationship that we just cannot avoid. And that's, I think, the starting point that we must take. To give a few examples, one which is in the article is about this project now already more than 10 years ago from the Flemish government in South Africa, where the idea of the Flemish government was we do it correctly if we let the government in South Africa decide on where our funding goes to. Because that's our eye-to-eye partner, and that's when we're doing things in a non-colonial way, that's the most correct way. Of course, the Department of Arts and Culture in South Africa is notorious for its lack of capacity, unfortunately. The department that has 600 people working for it, and very, very few of those are selected in their positions because of any kind of previous experience in the art sector. And the result of that was obviously also greatly problematic. On the other hand, you had the Swedish corporation that, for the case of Zimbabwe, decided to give a complete grant, so basically the whole fund that they would support in arts and culture in Zimbabwe, to an organization which they created, so the Zimbabwe Arts and Culture Trust Fund, which is completely run by Zimbabweans, which has a board of Zimbabweans. Undoubtedly, there's one or two Swedish people on that board, and I stand to be corrected. And that's, of course, a very different model. Because of the choice of these people, and very often it's about the choice of the right individuals in the right context in which to do that at that time, this was an extremely effective tool to support arts and culture in Zimbabwe. In both cases, the decision is really the initial decision of the funder, and in that sense, the power position of the funder is it's a complete illusion to say that we should work on a sort of partnership basis, or that we should rescind this position that we can't work in a colonial way. It is, I think, a colonial remnant. It is a colonial practice. And it's also, I think, at this point we should use words maybe where they're in a slightly provocative way, maybe to say that this is the reality that we're working today. We're talking about post-colonialism or neo-colonialism. Maybe we should just continue to talk about colonialism for the time being, and also see Switzerland, that I represent, as a colonial country at this point, because there's recently a lot of studies about how colonial countries are not necessarily countries that have formal colonies, and in the current context, that's what we're doing. So the flip side of the question, of course, with this bleak picture, should we stop doing it? And of course, when we stop doing it, then there's no money for the projects that we support, which very often we believe in. So the way to go about that for me is very clearly in the sort of clarity one can create about one's intentions. I think there is something to say. Probably there's a need for specific foundations that have an agenda in all kinds of issues that are related to society, that want people to create work that supports this kind of directions. There are other foundations like ours, and like other people here present, that really look very clearly at the development, the professional development of the independent art sector as such, and want to do that from the point of view of the professional artists and their sort of professional environment. And the most important thing is to have smart people at the head of that, who can take the opportunity to consult very widely about what really the immediate urgencies are in the artistic context. I think our concerns with the sort of burning world at this point are not only the funded concerns, very much artist concerns, and something that will definitely come up from that side as well. So for these organizations, it's very, very important to consult very widely. Having said that, again, if you talk to 100 different people, you get 100 different opinions about that. So there it also is, in the end, somewhere depending on your capacity of analysis, on your experience, on your good user experience, to be able to translate that into effective policies that can really make a difference in the artistic field. So basically that's a little bit in the direction where I went to. Maybe another point that was important there, which I continue to believe very strongly, which I want to add as a last point, that in a lot of these funding mechanisms that go from people that are working in a context where there is a lot of money and lots of good conditions to work in the arts and culture sector, towards contexts where those positions aren't available, it's extremely important for us to always make the kind of hypothetical exercise of what we require from our grantees. Is that something we would require from our own artists? And if that's not the case, I think we're doing something wrong. To put it in a very simple way, if you would want an African artist to make something about their impoverished context, or about that is something that is culturally clearly African, don't do that, because you would not ask from a Spanish artist to make something Spanish, or to make something about their very comfortable context. So that is absolutely perpetuating this kind of colonial relationship you have there. That's a simplistic example, but I think these kind of requirements and pressures can become very complex, and so complex that a lot of us will apply them in moments that we are not even aware that we're applying them.
Thank you. Amar, in your very good model that you gave us, was suggesting that democratic countries can give funding with objective, transparent criteria. Jasper just said that it has to do with power relation, there is always an agenda, and it very much depends on the person, the personality who's in the post, and the sensitivities that they have. Can you comment on how that relates to objective and transparent criteria? Is that a dream, or does that really exist?
أظن أنه يعني
I think
ما قدمته هنا
that what I've presented here
ما قدمته هنا ليس تقديم حصري يعني كل التجارب الموجودة لا تدخل بالضرورة في إطار واحد من الأمثلة التي قدمتها لأنه هناك طبعا بعض التجارب الناجحة
some successful examples
مثال الصندوق
are there. The example of the International Fund for Diversity, for Cultural Diversity of the UNESCO that was incepted in a transparent way based on transparent standards. And that's why I do believe that we can have initiatives where arbitration is acceptable and where the artist can express freely.
Thank you. Rana, you called yourself in one of our emails an intermediary. And you also questioned or asked some questions about what Jasper was referring to as these power relationships, and you were wondering about independence and funding. And I remember very well in the years when the AFAC, the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, was just a dream, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that not all the funds should be coming from Western sources, and why couldn't there be some Arab sources for this? Now you are kind of the intermediary, being able to play a role in those power relationships. Can you talk about that?
Thank you very much, Marianne. In fact, I'll try to answer your question through mainly 3 points. Switching to Arabic. هذه
The most important question, and from the first day we have this question without having a session concerning funding, is that funding having an influence on the values and the freedom of expression and the freedom of choosing a subject, the freedom of the experience, freedom of the innovation, and as well the freedom of the cultural institution in building cultural systems and cultural projects. So here I'm not only talking about the freedom of the artist as an individual, but as a whole dynamic. And here I am talking about a personal point of view, and we are all trying to be and we might all be here provocative because we are in front of a problematic. The answer is clear. The relationship between any funder and the recipient of the fund is a forced relationship, but I hope it's always a relationship where we have a certain balance between both, where we have negotiation, where we can find or where we can strike a balance between the powers. And what I mean here, I'm talking first of all about a region where we have no public funding except in some countries where government dedicate a certain amount of money to the cultural project, but in general we don't have that kind of project unless the event has a lot of PR. So, and we have exceptions of course, but in general there is no awareness concerning that subject, and individual contributions where many individuals are interested, they are contributing, they are supporting, but it's always a limited resource. So this, I'm talking based on that, how in that region, in that Orient, where we are trying hopelessly to find forces in terms of financing, can we continue? When I deal with funders, I deal with them as partners and as people that need me as I need them. I need their funds, but there are institutions as well having objectives, results that needs to be achieved. So at the end of the day, we are parties that will help them achieve their goals as they are helping us achieve our goals. So I always hope that we as Arab artists can build on that and can have a word to say in that relationship. The negotiation spaces are related to our capacity to have a clear agenda. I've once said during the first day that any donor will have his agenda. But it's not something bad, because we do have our agenda as individuals and institutions. We have our concerns, we have our agendas. So fixing an agenda against an agenda is a strength. It becomes a weakness when the funding is related to the agendas of the donors rather than people seeking funds. And the third aspect is to try to find more common ground with partners and donors. And common grounds can be achieved not only when the agendas are interlinked, but through accumulation, and that will lead to long-term relationships where the issue of funding won't be that problematic. Long-term relationships means transforming the relationship from being a relationship related to an economic aspect to a certain positivity, to a certain coalition. So when the donor and the Arab institution or the institution working in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq or anywhere else can be able to build a coalition with the donors serving its objective. So by this we change as well the dynamic of the relationship that is bothering us all. Second, concerning this system for the region, as Marianne mentioned, one of the main important things that I've mentioned when we were preparing through the emails was a question: do we have mediators such as us, we mediators, we cultural mediators? Can we as Arab institution be mediators between artists and donors, and is this role important or necessary? I'm not completely sure about my answer. What do we mean by mediators? We have strategies, annual plans. The donors have strategies and annual plans. And some donors are interested in supporting the artists of the region for different reasons. So how this work is done, most of the important donors cannot know the details of the region and the artists of the region as well as their experiences, even if they are aware of the general situation of the region, because generally these donors don't have persons in the field to know more how to disperse sponsorship for individuals. So do we have institutions that can play this role in a very positive way and be able to influence the politics of donors and not only cooperate with them? Do we have a role to play? I will give an example. Al-Mawrad today is a part of the steering committee preparing for the meeting of donors, of artistic donors in the Arab region that encompasses a big, many stakeholders supporting art in the region. So during these meetings, I've asked, and one of them was held in Beirut, I've asked, what is the role expected of cultural institutions in the Arab world to work hand in hand with the donors in terms of sponsorship policies and the policies in general? I do believe that a gathering for all the donors can be a good platform, and we should publish what they are deciding and try through this platform or other meetings such as our meeting today to talk about what is expected from the cultural institutions in order to have an influence on the donors' politics and not only open the channels of funds for the region. The third point, I don't know. So I don't know if that point was clear, but I will move to the third point. We can take a lot of ethical decisions concerning refusing funds, and yeah, sometimes I do agree that we need to reject fundings from certain parties, but because we have to make sure that we are always independent, having our word to say concerning our political, economic, social ideas, and based on that we can accept the funding, yes or no. But at the end of the day, if you want to talk about sustainability, I know that many people here have questions concerning the ethical aspect of the funding. I'm with that dialogue if we propose alternatives and if we suggest alternatives. We've been talking a lot about these alternatives, but we need to build on the experiences of the world and try to talk about many projects, many projects that can help our artwork. We have to think about the alternatives, because till now in the Arab region we still lack funding. So how we can revive the local funding, because as Marianne mentioned, when the Arab Fund was incepted, it was to have funding for the region and to have a fund where all the capital of investors, funding of investors can be harnessed in order to help the art work. But till now the fund didn't achieve its objective, though having a lot of improvement and development. So till now the objectives are not met. What are the alternatives? This is a very important question. Instead of asking ourselves, shall we accept the funding, yes or no? Shall we think about the international funding in a different way? Shall the Gulf country think that at the end of the day the oil resources will be depleted? So we can talk about that, and I believe that many entities in the innovation production industry are talking about that, or discussing that, in order to diversify the funding sources. And I do believe that the other parties, the other stakeholders, will need to talk about that in depth in order to find the alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you. Does everybody know that what she was talking about when she said the meeting of the donors in the Arab world? How many people don't know? Could you explain a little bit?
When it started, in fact, 8 years? Yeah. So 8 years ago, started an initiative called the Informal Donors Meeting for Arts and Culture in the Arab region. It's an annual informal meeting, supposedly more formal than expected, but it is an informal meeting gathering a large group of donors who fund arts and culture in the Arab region.
Hang on. Thank you. Too many questions. Why not? If you have a question, I'll be amazed. Or you have a question, or you have a comment? I have a question. Oh, not bad.
اللي حاجة ولا كثير مهم عن دور الوساطة، وهذه مسألة احنا اللي حكى دورنا عن الوساطة كثير مهم.
Be careful of the translators will implode.
What Rana mentioned concerning mediation is very important, and it's a subject that we are discussing now in Palestine. Donors won't know the exact context, the exact local context. My question to Rana concern the independence of donors in two terms. With this mediation, we will be putting or creating some standards, artistic standards concerning what is convenient, yes or no, what is contemporary art and what is not. And here we will be having some monopoly, and that's what we are facing currently in Palestine with some institutions. So how can we overcome this problem and maintain this status that can currently be a solution for many problems. My second question concerns the democratization. I will give you an example. In Palestine now we have many important donors that are entering in coalition with local donors. We have many important local donors, or two main institutions. So the money was going to independent institutions, but now the money is transferred in the framework of this coalition, this big coalition. So the small institutions are not being taken into consideration. So a big donor was giving funds to many small institutions, but now through this big coalition, funding is only going to big institutions. The second question, when doing this coalition, the donors are not asking the point of view of the society or about the priorities of the society. Now we don't have a strategic work, and we don't know what is the opinion of the independent sector. So how can we overcome all these issues? Because in Palestine we have backfires. There are backfires instead of being a solution for the problem.
I think Alma and then Iman, and then you can answer again. It's related, yeah?
I think one point of this
أعتقد أن
personal relations aspect, because treating the relationship, the personal relation as donor beneficiary is very controversial when it comes to the core exchange, artistic exchange and cultural exchange between the country and two countries, for example, or regions, of course. And that's one area. The other is even more risky. It's about those institutions becoming a cartel, and we see the relationship is becoming very competitive. It's the Coca-Cola versus the Pepsi-Cola, and I agree with you, Rana, and thank you for highlighting the issue that I think an annual report will ensure transparency, will answer the many accusations that are happening in the couloir about corruption, about allies coming together in forms of reports that serve certain institutions, and you know exactly that I'm not hallucinating, and those things are happening in our region. But I mean, there's an added value that this alliance as such can respond on an emergency basis very quickly. But it's the same concept of having one dictator or having multiple parties to speak with. So the issue of democratization is very critical, and it's very dangerous to fall into the trap of brokering. It's really going into an area where commercializing art, I would say, rather than funding, or rather than keeping that core intellectual human value of the relationship.
Let me stop for a minute. Speakers.
بدي أتفق إنه طبعا الممولين عندهم أجندات، أنا بفكر مش الكل ينحط ببطاقة واحدة، يعني بمعنى في كمان ممولين متضامنين، يعني هذول كمان ما ننسى في تمويل له علاقة بالتضامن.
Some donors are presenting funds in solidarity with some issues and some subjects. So we can't generalize, and we have to think how the institution will respond to the funding. Concerning the mediation, we've tried it, but after a certain period of time, mediation will become a burden, and even a part of the funding will go to maintain this mediation in the structure. So how can we overcome this and build confidence Because sometimes, in lack of confidence, we will have to pay much more money. I will try to comment fast, but I think that here I've set myself a trap. Solidarity is an agenda here. I'm not saying that all agendas are negative. They have donors have agenda, even if they are agendas of solidarities. So they are good agendas. Concerning mediation, I'm not only talking about fiscal mediation. I'm talking about cultural mediation as well. And since the first session on IETM, we've talked about the mediation that an artist or an art institution will have to do in the society. And here I'm talking about the same principle. I'm talking about politics and about economic orientation. Some institution can play a role in being a mediator and in attracting additional funds for donors to take care of the region, have interest for the region, and that if their project and if their projects are as well in the interest of the art in the region. So fiscal mediation is there. And if you want to see the first question of Fatin, if you want to make sure that this institution won't have a monopoly on the orientation of the artwork in our region, we have to make sure that they are accountable. And mediation don't have to be putting an end to the relationship or impeding the relationship between the two parties, because a good cultural relationship means opening the floor, opening the door to transparency, and this mediation will be the translation of needs and orientations as well trends in the cultural field in the Arab world, but through confidence and a certain level of confidence. So this institution or this donor will move things forward. So we have two types of mediation. So the most important thing is, first of all, the diversity of the donors. The problem is that in the region we just have like 10 institutions able to provide funds, not more than that. So for any program we need to diversify the donors. If we only have one donor, we will have to abide by its condition. But if we have like 5 donors, that will be easier for us to have a certain freedom. And we have as well to make sure that none of these institutions will have an influence on the cultural trends of the artwork in the region. We have to empower our institutions, our artists, in order to guarantee this freedom of expression.
I'd love to just end on that. It's such a positive message.
أحب كثيرا أن ننهي.
What we're talking about is the tendency for centralizing these funds. So once again, the foundations are some of the foundations are giving their funds to another foundation to treat. So there are less possibilities for the people in the region to apply for funds. I give an example of Soros Foundation and Hivos Foundation, who are sometimes giving all of their funds for a certain region or country to the other one to deal with. So instead of having 2 doors to knock on, you only have one. We're also talking about gatekeepers. So who is the gatekeeper? Why do we pay for the gatekeeper when perhaps we feel we don't need that gatekeeper? I think the same thing could be said in terms of curators and programmers, because we're talking here a lot about programs and projects, whereas from an individual artistic point of view, they might feel the same about gatekeepers who are gatekeeping artistically. But what we're also talking about here is whoever is in the position of being on the other level, are they listening? Are they listening to the intermediary who's listening to the artist, and perhaps the audience too, I'm not sure? And are they flexible enough? Because let's face it, none of the people here are the ultimate people who sign the checks. None of the people here are the ultimate people who are responsible for the entire policy of the entire institution. We do not have the director generals, we don't have these are people who also have to argue for what they believe in from what they've been hearing from the field. And I'm going to ask Pascal, her name, who probably has one of the most difficult jobs of making the donor listen, because you are working with the European Commission.
We try. I don't know if we could work with the European Commission. We talk a lot about agenda, and I want to go through things. And we are talking about agenda, and I think it's a kind of articulation between the political project and the context. And it's maybe quite interesting to go back to the political project and to the context. The context is quite difficult to define the context. We are in a moment of we use a lot of post-colonial, post-national, post things to define the context. But we know 2 or 3 things about this context. We know that it will change very quickly, definitely, and a lot of crises. We know this. It's not so optimistic, but it's the reality of this context. And in this area, we know that for 2, 3, 5 years, we will have a lot of reorganization or a lot of recomposition in the different countries, in the regions, through economy, through mobilities of persons, through a lot of things. So it's quite important to have this context, because in front of we have the political project and the articulation between the context and the political project to define an agenda. And if we look at the political project at the moment, when we are talking about European opinion, it's difficult to say if we have a political project or if we have different political projects, and if we have to choose between these different political projects. So we know that the UK has decided to leave, so we will see in 2 years what will happen, but we are sure that this point will reorganize completely the project. The UK has to find its own external policy, has to redefine what it wants to do in this area through culture and through different policy. But at the moment in Brussels, we talk a lot about culture and external policy. And the Brexit give quite a big impulsion to this new, agenda, a new point of the political project. And we know that we have 2 or 3 interesting or dangerous points in this recomposition. I'm not sure that we could be confident or we could be afraid of the future. We have to look at the situation and everything could be dangerous or quite interesting. One of the points is something about security. It's an obsession in Europe, you know. And when we are talking about culture and external policy, the first point is how we will articulate this issue of security and this issue of culture. So we have to redefine what is the intercultural relationship. We know that we have something about regions in this point, in this area. And what could happen? The first thing I think could happen is more money. It's quite interesting, but more money. I'm quite sure in 2 or 3 years we will have a lot of money for culture in this area. But culture with this difficulty to define it through this necessity to redefine interculturality, we would like to create a more balanced situation, something like an horizontal dialogue, something where we could define a common approach of a common situation, or if we want to say which kind of development, which kind of choices the South has to do, and certainly, European is quite arrogant, so we could be quite afraid that this redefinition of the interculturality has to become something like an imposition of a model. So we have to look at the situation, but at the same time to look at the situation as for the opportunities and for the dangers, and really to look at the opportunity. The second point I want to underline is the necessity to talk about independency. We know that this external policy and this policy, European policy, it's impossible to imagine that to develop this policy, we know that we need independent actors, not national actors. A lot of diplomacy imagine that they have to be ready to take the money. I work in France at the moment, so you can imagine. So the British Council will leave, so we will have a lot of funds, new funds, and we could use these funds to imagine new cultural activities. But we know that the cultural diplomacy certainly has something to do, but we need to have a strong civil society able to imagine the new way of actions regarding this new context. So which kind of things we could imagine for independence? The first thing is really to talk about independence, because we don't have the same definition. When we are talking about independence in the north of Europe, is something regarding possibility of receiving some subsidies, public subsidies, to develop his own works. But when you talk about independence in Turkey, for example, we have a completely other definition. But not at all something about public money. It's something about possibility to develop in your work. So independence is important, because if we don't take this point really seriously, we will have a lot of other debates, like entrepreneurship. One of the points, we imagine that entrepreneurship will be the solution for everything, for us also. But it's different to imagine a civil society with strong independent actors and a civil society composed by entrepreneurs. That's two main jobs, and we have also to face this problem. The last point I would like to underline is where we could recompose this civil society. And if we look at the network at the moment, we could be sure that we need to find a new step in the development of the network. And a new step in the development more connected with the context and more connected with the difficulty and the point on the line of the tensions in this context. So we have to face something about security. We never talk in the network, in the cultural network, about security. We have to talk the intercultural dialogue strongly, and not as a kind of European or UNESCO things. We have really to talk about what is behind this and what we could create. And we have also to imagine network able to develop and to support new communities of work, new communities of little groups of independent actors able to produce this different situation or with this different project units, something in this way. Talking with the European Commission about this, impossible, difficult, not impossible, but difficult. But if we talk with the European Commission, not through culture or not through funds, but through politics and through in the political debate, I think we could open different doors. One is open last July by Mrs. Mogherini, the High Representative of External Policy. And she has opened the doors to the cultural actors and asked the cultural actors if we could do something in this situation. At the moment we don't have place where we could talk and imagine this kind of answer, but at the moment some politicians opened space or open subject on they would like to exchange with us about what we could do, but we are not really ready. So I think it's quite important this kind of meeting because certainly we have to face very practical things, but at the same time we have also to face the necessity to have a strong political approach in order to talk with this kind of multilateral donors or funders. And it's one of the points I think for the network is really to choose where we want to build in this public broken position and this political position of this arena.
Hello? Thank you, Pascal. If I heard you well, you're talking about a number of different things, but you're also talking about the kind of...
I'm sorry to interrupt. We need 1 minute because the translators have to leave and we are taking their place. So we're switching.
Okay. The translators are doing such an amazing job here. I can tell you... Whether it's for the good or the bad, if we have translating interpreters in Europe working at this conference, they would only work for 2 hours before they have a lengthy break. The two would never work for the whole day, they would work for a half a day. And they certainly wouldn't be translating simultaneously between 3 languages. So how these 2 women are doing this, I don't know, but they should go home and rest. Okay, we are going to speak very slowly for our 2 new interpreters, right, everybody? Pascal, if I understood you well, you were talking also about not only the kinds of trends, political trends in European institutions, such as what you feel is coming, an obsession with security. We've also seen a new program about culture and refugees, which reminds me of something that Todd Lester always talks about, is refugee porn. So are these real projects, or are they projects that really have something to do with what Judith referred to as the need, the inner need of artists to work with the community? You're talking about something which I heard a long time ago, is being ready to speak to politicians about these kinds of political trends and know what you want to say. The first time I met a European politician, years and years ago, it was a French one, very, very strong woman, you know, amazing intellect. I walked into her office and she said, "Yes, Mrs. Dublé, you have 7 minutes. I'm a very busy woman. What is it that you wanted me to do?" It was a really good training. So you're saying that within the networks, we should be talking about these issues so that we can get our story straight. If we want them to listen, we have to be able to know what we want, and we have to be able to know what we want as a group.
As a group? Go ahead. And not only talking about money.
And not to be able also to not to talk about only about money, but really to talk about, I don't know if it's a political project, something like maybe to take part of the debate about the society. We could maybe have this kind of definition. And at this moment really the cultural sector is really not in this kind of debate, and maybe not able to be in. It's quite difficult because we have it's quite difficult to redefine a political project. We have a lot of different. I'm sure if we talk about refugees, we could agree, but I think we couldn't. And about the answer, about the kind of thing we could do, as you could say, we have so much refugee-born things during the last years in Europe. But really we have to take part of the debate and to see which kind of things we could propose and which kind of analysis of the situation we have. And this kind of dialogue is completely necessary in this moment of a very strong working position. Everything is open. And we know that in the 2 or 3 years we will have stronger working positions than we have what we had before. And we have to be in this debate. It's difficult because we have at the same time our own project, our own agenda, our own problem about money, about everything. But if we don't go in this debate, I think we will run after money, or we will run after the politicians if they want to have a policy for culture. And really we have to be an actor of the civil debate, something like citizens and cultural actors in the working position of citizenship.
I'm also reminded of a city cultural politician in the city of Turin in Italy who changed from culture to, I think her department was called social inclusion. And she said, you know, when the cultural people come to me, they say, we want this much money. And when the social people come to me, they say, we have this dream. She said, who do you think I like to listen to? So, I will turn to the poor person who has to defend Brexit. You don't have to. But I'll also just mention a little anecdote which English people or British people will know very well. For years and years, I've worked for the Arts Council in England for about 5 years. Long time ago. And there was a joke which is so boring that we all have heard it so many times, and this has to do with the gatekeepers, is that actually what should happen is there should just be one little window and one person sitting there with a checkbook. You know, we don't need all these extra people and experts and all the rest of it. So, Stephen, from your position at the British Council, and you have been promoted, so you're not the person with the little window and the checkbook, but you really are an intermediary between being able to speak to that top level and people being able to understand the people who are working on the ground, face to face, the artists, working with the audiences. Are you a friend or a foe?
Well, first of all, actually I'm just saying that. First of all, I have to say it's a joy to come to. I spent 5 years working in the Middle East, and to come to a meeting, and the most contentious thing I have to deal with is UK's relationship with Europe, and not the Balfour Declaration or lines drawn on the map is in a way a joy. Brexit is a disaster, I think, a disaster in many ways. But one of the sadder things about it is I don't think it changes the way the UK looks at its external policy at all, or even for that matter the British Council looks at its external policy. Because sadly, it didn't really see itself as doing those things with Europe in the first place. So, which I say is a sadness, as far as I'm concerned, a complete sadness, but true. And I think one of the few joys that may come out of Brexit is that organisations like ours now have to take Europe seriously, have to look at a new relationship with Europe, which it's never done before. However, I better get on. I'm aware I'm the last person. The translators have already gone, and probably all of you wish you'd gone as well. But so actually, I'll keep it very quick because I wrote. That's all the notes I've written, and I've forgotten my glasses, so I can't see them anymore. And the most worrying thing Jasper said for me in his description of the role of international art in the region was that the important thing was to have someone smart at the top, because I moved back to the UK to be on the top of a certain fund that's being created, and I'm in no way smart. I didn't go to university, and the only thing I was ever trained to do was be an actor. So this is probably very worrying for everybody who's about to apply for that fund. But what I'll do is just, I say that partly because also I'm not going to go into the theory of funding, because I don't have the background and I probably don't have the understanding either. I'm just going to make 4 very practical observations from my relationship with funding, and then some reflections afterwards. My simple answer to the question of is funding friend or foe would be that it is automatically neither and can be either. Broadly, funding obviously covers, funding programs covers an awful lot as a mere sort of detail and a lot of complexity. But broadly, there's people with money who want to do something. That thing has parameters, has an agenda, as Mara said. Then if that fits with the artist's agenda, that can be a threat. If it doesn't fit very well, it's a balance of frustrations. If it's badly, then it can be destructive. So the four observations I would make, and I'm aware I'm here as a funder, I'm not ducking that, I even bought a suit to demonstrate it, but the first couple are from, as an artist, and I would observe, when I felt freest was just before I really was aware of the idea of my relationship and funding. So as a young actor, I was able to live with not much money and had a lot of time, and in that sense therefore felt free because I didn't have much money. And then I had the first sort of element of good fortune in my career, which was to adapt a play by a famous Italian writer, Dario Fo. It was published, it was quite celebrated. Therefore, I got commissions. I had friends around me who were struggling as writers, I didn't have to struggle. Suddenly, somebody was giving me a cheque to do what I do. If you like, that was with commerce. What I would notice about that is, in one sense, it's very free. Nobody was telling you what hours I should work, how I should do it, or whatever, and I got the money up front largely. But it was probably the most restrictive thing I ever did artists, because you're aware of the commercial restraints around it, including how many people you write for. It has to go to the West End, so it has to be this kind of play. It has to be delivered in this way. That was my first with the sort of commercial route of funding. For one reason or another, I moved to a theatre in Scotland as a director, and we were incredibly fortunate, very fortunate. Small city of only 150,000 people. We were the best funded theatre in Scotland. I note, however, that funding came from various things we did. So from social work sources for our work in community development, from education for our work with excluded young people who weren't working through the education system, through the health service, through mental health. Well, actually 5%, roughly 5% of our funding was to make work, was to make kids. The rest of it was either for the building itself, for the staff, or for one of those functions. But nevertheless, that was a huge resource. Great frustration, and one of the frustrations was when our funders sought to do things, promote new writers, let's say, why not just give us the money? Why set up a big scheme that you have to apply for, etc., etc. That was the frustration of the time. Move on to my third, is when I came to Cairo to be Director of Arts for the Middle East and North Africa for the British Council. And the first question people tend to ask you when you're at meetings like this is what is the agenda? What's the hidden agenda? I always used to answer it in the same way. Well, there is a very clear agenda. It's not very well hidden because it's in the name, British Council, and that obviously what you're looking to do is make direct connections, as I say, sadly, with particularly one country. And what I observed then about funding is obviously people were coming to you in a very different way. They were looking for, as the question suggests, support for the artistic landscape. And that is a difficult interaction, because I think it could be a useful thing to have that variety of funding, as Rana was suggesting, if the base of public funding is there. If it's not, then you're completely fooled by those agendas. To give a little fairly benign example, I guess, in the British Council cases, you were seeing artists all the time that didn't really need to be connecting with the UK. They would do their project much better without a British artist, or without the need to go backwards and forwards to Britain. But that's what came with our funding. Yeah. So, as I said, my fourth is now. Now, so what I'm doing back in the UK, or one part of what I'm doing back in the UK, is a fund with the UK government wanting to have a cultural protection fund. And so for the first time, I'm sort of looking at how it works for political funds. And what I noticed is that my interest has suddenly become about putting a set of parameters that restrict the people who are about to apply to it. Why? Well, because what has happened already is otherwise you get patronage. Strictly between us, of course, they won't go out of the room, but the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer happened to be a good friend of the guy who runs the British Museum. They went to school together. So when they first thought of doing this, the money went directly that way. So to stop that, you obviously say, well, we'll do this, do this, do this, do this. That means saying, right, there's a certain amount of countries you will work with. So why not Mali, why Sudan? It's, in the end, you put a box around it. And you do that, I suppose, for the sake of transparency in some way. I happen to think that you can take things like systems, transparency, and all those things far too far. Because if you take it too far, you lose humanity out of it. And you stop looking at, for example, is that a good project? Is that just does that feel like a good project? There's no way of doing that within parameters and boxes. So that's really me. My own reflections on all that would be, I think that however you look at where the money's coming from, if we're thinking of the money as what is broadly given in kind of taxes in the organisation of society, whether within a country, or whether we're looking at things like the huge amounts spent by our country, by the EU, on things like development, then in all that sphere, I think it's, personally, I think it's vitally important that arts and culture has a share of that. And I think therefore it's slightly dangerous to look at, because in any one situation there are dangers attached to it, to walk away from that whole sphere of funding. I think also it's equally important to be cautious about other forms of funding as any kind of elixir, whether that's patronage through corporations and businesses or patronage through individuals. All of these things have a certain degree of danger attached to them. And finally, I suppose I would say that all sounds like it's suggesting that the kind of European model of a sort of mixed funding is the answer and important. I would say it isn't. I think the answer is something more about kind of tailoring the balance of those things to the culture you're working in. I think the UK is a great example of what can go wrong. At the moment, I think there is a funding crisis through being far too. We are basically funding institutions. We're funding buildings rather than work, and we tend to be judging what we're doing on efficiency, on are you employing good practice rather than are good things coming out at the end? That's very good.
Thank you. So we've come full circle in a way, Amar, to your scheme that we can have democratic societies or economies and still have what I used to call the director's back pocket. I went to school with her. Here's some money. We can also have criteria that can be transparent but without humanity. So we've actually come to a brilliant position of having no conclusion whatsoever. And we haven't even talked about crowdfunding, and we haven't talked about too much about sustainability. And we haven't even approached what was coming to our mind at the time. They say that populations get the politicians they deserve. Do the formats of our funding reflect the signs of the times and somehow reflect our own desires, bad habits, patterns of thinking? I would like to ask one of the interpreters there how much more time we have. It's not okay, so we can be here until 10. I'm sure you'd love that. But I would really like to take at least, let's say, 5 questions. Comments or questions. I saw you first, and then number 2, and then okay, so there's the first. Okay.
In dialogue with funding bodies. I'm going to talk about the Lebanese example because this is where I live and work. What do we do when there are no precise priorities, when there are no researches or work on the ground that actually directs the funding towards the right places? Especially outside the capital when with decentralization, because there's not enough researches, there's not enough work that emphasizes priorities that can influence funders. And these few organizations that you are representing, have you taken this consideration as a priority to encourage researchers and encourage mapping or existing forms or priorities? And another idea I'd like to talk about is that this discussion has somehow was limited to funding bodies. But in my opinion, funding covers more than just funding bodies. It also covers community and crowdfunding. It also includes the pressure that can be how governments can be pressured to contribute to funding culture, and not only ministries of culture but also ministry of the economy, some taxes systems or the lottery systems, and this is where our role comes to the surface, and that's where we're not taking our responsibility fully, is that we're not in coalitions that are strong enough to exercise this pressure. Our lack of organization is somehow a factor that threatens the liberty of culture practice. And from Lebanon, this also applies internationally.
Comments, not questions, because we won't have time to answer them. Thank you, but really good points. Please.
Unfortunately, I had a question. I will ask it anyway. Because but it's at the same time the reaction concerning Europe. I come back to that. First question is, I would like to have some ideas about this, how the European Union sees the external relation, the future of external relation, and how we Europeans could build in that frame a meaningful bridge to the region here, for example, for the future, in the future project. And then the second part of this question and reaction is, I'm reacting because you were saying that we cultural actors should be part of the European debate and should be political actors. And I heard you saying that for a long time now, and you repeated it. And in a way, we tried. We cultural actors of Europe tried that. We did this Alliance for Culture that with IETM is also part of. And for me, this is more about we have a dream than we want money. And it's also difficult to. But now we have a problem is that we don't really know how to go further and how to do the lobbying work that should be done. And should lobbying work be done, or is there really space for a political debate on the European project? At this point, I have the impression that there is no political project at all in Europe, or that there are a lot of different political projects. There's no political dream anymore. So that's what my point is. Just how can we go further than this repeating? We should be actors.
Can I just remind you that we're not talking only about Europe. We're talking about the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. And just as a small point,
that's why
having left my very close and long-time relationship with the European Commission's cultural unit, it is far more easier. That's not correct English. It's far easier to speak to the youth parts of the Commission, to speak to the education parts of the Commission. It's easier, you have a better dialogue with the development parts of the European Commission. And so when we're speaking about Europe in this panel, we're talking about the way that Europe is relating to the Middle East and North Africa. Just to correct. Yeah. And the third hand, somebody before. Who was the third person?
Yeah, I just have an observation. I'm speaking from the perspective of, I guess, an artist and director of a very small organization with some international experience. So I think in the past maybe 10 years, performing artists, and not talking exclusively about performing artists, in at least the Arab Levant have, I think, pursued like 3 strategies outside of the traditional festival commissioning economy. The first is to be subsumed by the contemporary art circuit, to adapt their work so that it's a commodity for biennials, basically, in galleries. The second is to succumb to like the use of digital technologies and multimedias, and to make that the center of the work. And then the third, of course, is to subscribe to like the humanitarian agenda, which we're all familiar with that. I'm wondering, and I guess maybe then you're probably the main person who can address this question. But among the funding, like the main funding bodies in the region, I'm wondering how seriously they're approaching particular private sector companies and thinking about strategies approaching those sectors through disciplinary lenses. So in other words, are these organizations, these peer organizations, are they, for instance, approaching the giant engineering firms, for instance, to begin to think about, okay, can we develop a funding initiative that somehow integrates the ideas of engineering and disseminates these ideas, right? And maybe we make some sacrifices on the level of content, fine, who cares? But at the end of the day, we're going to be diversifying the funding. Are we approaching institutions who are interested in medical, funding from medicine, for instance? dental industry. I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. Or the hospitality industry, even. What is that relationship like?
Okay, I said 5 questions, and I had 3 hands that went up. Vahid, I know you well enough, and you know me well enough. I'm going to cut it there because I think I'm really going to cut it there because I think that everybody is exhausted. There are lots of people leaving, and we can't abuse the people who come in to help us either. So normally when we get out and wait for the bus, or we get into the bar, or whatever the equivalent of the bar is, we talk about other things. Can I ask you to keep continuing this conversation when you get out the door? Thank you so much, everybody.